I have very little to say about me. I'm not a very important person. I'm Huma. I teach anthropology at Capitalism University here. Within anthropology, I work on the borders of medical anthropology, feminist anthropology, and health issues, broadly speaking. Before we go into, and what I'm going to talk about today is popular cultural discourse and state health policy, about positions and violence against women being a case study of rural Punjab. Now, before I go into it, I need to sort of create a little background about where I'm coming at it from. One earlier, since we've been talking about militarization this morning a whole lot, and to me, militarization is really not about army people as a cadre. To me, militarization is a mindset. It is a mindset which stands for appropriating other people's reality, controlling other people's existence and being, and brutalizing it. Now, for me also, militarization as in brutality and controlling other people's being and state of existence is something which is very basic to the patriarchal setups and to patriarchy as a mindset. Now, I also believe that patriarchal mindset or military mindset that we often associate with men is really not something which grows out of male nature. It is something which is very culturally constructed. Again, we were earlier talking about truths and complete truths, and very early in the morning we were talking about presenting the complete picture and all. I am not going to pretend to present any complete picture because I do not think that is possible. I think we as academicians and researchers, all of us have positions, and that as a consequence of having those positions, we at best create partial truths and positional realities. And at the very outset, I'd like for people to know that I have a position. And I am going to look at the government of Pakistan's health policy vis-a-vis women and about the popular cultural discourse about women's body and the conditions of women's body that sort of fall into the semantic category called Zanana Bimariyan, women's diseases. And I'm looking at it from a particular position, and I'll delineate my position here. Now, also sort of continuing what Meena ji had said earlier on, despite what we may find problematic about the socialist feminist stance, I do think that women's ability to, the fact that they are laborers and they're reproducers of laborers and they're primarily responsible for producing the technical and social relationships of production in the next generation, owing to the fact that culture has given them the duty of bringing up the new generations. I think, for me, I mean, that's my position, and we can again sort of agree to disagree on that, but I think my position falls very, very close to socialist feminism, and I find this paradigm of women being producers and reproducers being, if not the sole, a very major cause of female subordination. So that's where I'm coming at this whole thing from. Now, my stance is that Pakistan's 53 years of existence as a sovereign state comprises a continuing crisis in Gramscian sense, representing hegemonic struggles between the feudal interest and the commercial/industrial interests and their allies. And these 53 years can be divided into 7, some would say 8 periods of relative stabilization, each separated from the other by a period of convulsive change. Now, each one of these periods of relative stabilization in Pakistan represented a social formation comprising 2 overlapping and interpenetrating modes of production, namely feudal and capitalist. So I do not believe that Pakistan has, like Europe, gone through a historic process where capitalism has sort of replaced, uprooted the feudal system. And this is an argument that I'm primarily taking from works of Umar Asghar or Surush Irfani and others. that it is a situation, the historic conditions in which capitalism came into South Asia and then we inherited it as a quote and unquote sovereign state, was qualitatively different from what happened in Europe, and therefore it is a situation where there's a coexistence of an interpenetrative sort of a situation between feudal mode of production as well as the capitalist mode of production, and that my stance on this issue is that starting from the creation of Pakistan, in fact starting from the creation of the Muslim nationhood in India, starting from Jinnah, who to me represented the Muslim bourgeoisie interest of Bombay and Madras and the Salariat of UP. Starting from there, and then the problems that Muslim League had in terms of getting people to understand that they represented Muslims, as a consequence of which in 1937 you lost in Muslim majority areas. As a consequence of that, the compromise that the commercial interest, Muslim commercial interest, the deal that they had to strike with the Punjabi landed aristocracy, that is the starting point. And ever since then, to me, Pakistan's politics is really, if you really want to simplify it, it's nothing but the landed aristocracy fighting the commercial industrial interest. And I have a slight problem with this armed forces sort of coming in as a third party. To me, armed forces, the capitalist interest and the feudal interest that sort of has been struggling with each other throughout the history of Pakistan's sovereignty, if we have to call it that, that basically is a fight over control over the economic resource. And the control over economic resource in both modes of production lies not with women but with men. And military, to me, really represents the salariat and the middle class, which is educated professional people, and they also sort of it's just another form of males trying to keep the power within the male courts. So to me, there are three parties to the struggle: the armed forces, the feudal interest, and the industrial commercial interest. And as they fought each other, and whenever the two primary partners are the feudal interest and the capitalist interest, and whenever the fight gets to be too intense, and there is a sense that the patriarchal power may be weakened, the military steps in and military really doesn't represent anything else, not better nor worse. It's just another form of propping up the very different types of men fighting each other for different types of needs that they have and for control over economic resource. So I take that stance from I'm basing it on the works of people like Desai and Golkowski, and in our own context, Mustafa and Griffin and Khan and Laporte and Shahid Burki and these people. So that's where I'm coming at it from. Now, the reasons why I've chosen the domain of health to discuss this inter-mode of production conflict, which manifests itself in gender subordination. I could have, why not some other institution? Why health? There are several reasons for it. One, I believe that women, before and beyond being anything else, are laborers and reproducers of laborers. And for the efficient working of any mode of production, their functional health is of paramount concern. They have to be in a position where they can physically go in and perform the labor, produce use value and surplus value, exchange value, and keep the class inequality of the class structure, be it in feudal system or be it in capitalist system, alive. So and this whole thing, the functional health of women, gets defined and implemented within the domain of health policy planning. So that's one reason I've sort of chosen to look into these two issues within the larger sort of orbit of health policy planning and popular cultural discourse about women's bodies and health. Secondly, the way any social system defines health is determined by the type of work that it needs to get out of the workers and the amount and type of investments that the society is willing to make in order to achieve this state. And thirdly, I believe that it is in the female labor, unlike the male labor, that lies the potential for the perpetuation of the technical and social relationships of production required for the efficient working of any mode of production, because culturally women have been given the domestic domain and they have been entrusted with raising the children of the next generation. So in order to produce the next generation of various classes in any one of the mode of production, women have to be controlled and women have to be sort of guided. You can't afford, it's like, to me, it's like if somebody was saying, okay, fine, if we produce and reproduce laborers, then that's a source of power. Why should that end up being a source of subjugation? To me, it's like the more valuable the resource is for the working of the society, the more difficult it is to just let it make its own decisions. It has to be controlled and it has to be kept in its place and it has to be regulated, because at different points in society, the labor needs are different. The values with which you want people to go into the world of work and leisure, say 20 years, 30 years, 40 years down the road, they are different. And since mothers are bringing up these children, therefore you can't really afford to let them loose. Because if they are not regulated, then precisely because of the same reason that they're bringing up children, they're also, if they're not regulated, then through the process of socialization, they can be major sources of resistance to patriarchy here, and patriarchal control, and the system cannot afford to do that. Now, so it's owing to these possibilities inherent in female labor that women's labor, its form, the structure and dynamic needs to be controlled and regulated by those in power. And I'm arguing here that women's health policy and popular cultural discourse about women's sexuality and reproductive parts are two most important positions within the larger civil society of Pakistan, from where a war of positions in a very Foucauldian sense is being waged against women for the last 53 years or so. Now, I'll start off with just delineating some of the concepts that that will sort of creep into the paper as I go on with it. I'm defining discourse here as linguistic practice which is used as an instrument of disseminating ideological in a very Marxist sense. Ideological meanings in a society, perpetuating power relationships, reinforcing relationships of domination and reproducing them. Primarily a definition that comes out of Hendrix's and Thompson's work. I'm also saying that female knowledge about their bodies and reproductive organs in the villages that I've worked in, on which part of this paper is based, and the identity which grows out of that knowledge is distinct from and subordinate to males. And the greater the systemic need for free and cheap labor, creation of surplus value and profit making, the greater the female subordination would be. I mean, it was that way in my locales and it would be that way anywhere. I'm also sort of arguing, following Alan Young and his group of people, that women's knowledge about their bodies is of 5 different types, namely theoretical knowledge, theorized knowledge, rationalized knowledge, intersubjective knowledge, and negotiative knowledge. And I'm also taking a stand that none of these ways through which women know their bodies is determined by the innate natural characteristics of female being. These are culturally taught and culturally learned forms of knowledge. These are constructs resulting out of group engagement of differentially positioned women within the discourses, practices and institutions that lend value, meaning and effect to female bodies. Now, this personal engagement does not only take place, this personal engagement of women with various types of discourses that are going around. My position is that it doesn't take place only within a social context where they're there, but it's within that context, within the objective economic conditions and the cultural and political institutions and ideologies. That's the gambit within which these women are getting engaged with these different discourses out there and creating a reality for themselves. Now, it's also a historical process for me of consciousness, where material reality is, as religious would argue, interpreted or reconstructed by each person within the horizon of meanings and knowledge available in their culture at given historical moments. Now, I'm also saying that these forms of knowledge are not very rigid. They're fluid, emerging, becoming. So there's the same women at different points in her life may end up getting engaged with slightly different forms of discourses, and constructing her own reality, and understanding her own self and the possibilities and self that arise out of it at different points. Now, the interpretive and reconstructive dimension of these knowledge forms make women not just passive recipients of information, because these are very fluid arrangements. So, for me, women are not just passive recipients of what is going on out there in terms of discourses, but they're thinking subjects, they're having agencies. However, they're active agents functioning within historically specific discursive configurations. Now, I'm arguing also that the relations of production and the economic structure of a given social formation creates a terrain which favors the dissemination and existence of certain modes of thought and discourses. And there's always, in terms of discourse and the discourses that these women are borrowing from, there's always what Gramsci would say, sort of a disequilibrium there. A particular discursive configuration around female body and reproductive health is only one of the multidimensional and multi-arena war of positions being fought by various social forces at a given time and space to control women who are forced laborers, reproducers, etc. Now, since women are constructing their engendered identity by understanding their body and its differential capacities through the health discourses controlled and regulated by combating classes or segments of classes striving to establish political and economic hegemony at a given time in a social form, for most part, women's resistance to one health discourse, and this is something which bothers me but which my fieldwork sort of supports. So for most part, women's resistance to one health discourse does not mean freedom from masculine and social control for them. They just shift their location from one system of control and oppression to another. They remain, because the way I sort of saw it in my field, the modern medical discourse, as well as what the Amils were saying, as well was what the religion was saying about women's reproductive health and body. It was all really different voices of patriarchy and masculinity. So, although women are not just being passive recipients, they are actively getting engaged with discourses, but since the discourses, all different forms of discourses circulating in our rural areas are really just different forms of masculine discourses coming out of and produced and disseminated by different types of men with different types of control needs. Therefore, when a woman rejects the supernatural understanding of her reproductive failure and starts thinking in terms of some biological causes of her reproductive failure, I don't see that as necessarily a liberating or empowering experience for the woman. I also don't see that as a feminist sort of understanding of her own body, because to me, she's just gone from the status of property of a group to being the captive of the industrial, the pharmaceutical, the modern medicine domain, which is again controlled by men, and which is basically throwing out values which are very patriarchal. So it's really a matter of shifting from one type of patriarchal captivity to another type of patriarchal captivity. Now, after having said that, I don't think it is a situation which is absolutely hopeless, and where feminist consciousness of the body and the reproductive organs cannot be attained, and women cannot, under any circumstances, get to know their sexuality as women. But the degree to which this alternative feminist health discourse can be developed, it is a matter of the political, economic, and ideological relational metrics of the society. So unless I feel, unless we are able to redistribute the economic resource in a fashion that women are not just working, but they also have control over economic resource. They're controlling their expenditures. Unless we, from a very radical feminist perspective, undertake some serious consciousness raising, coupled with economic liberation of women, so that a real slit in the consciousness, a feminist slit in the consciousness of women can be created. I think that is a possibility, but then in order to do that, I think a few things will have to be done. One, various organizations in this country, a lot has been said about is there a feminist movement in South Asia or not, or in this country or not, or whatever. But and I feel that we really don't have a feminist movement in this country. We have various organizations working for very important women's causes, but that split of feminist consciousness that I feel can be created, and that very heterodoxic feminist, genuine feminist understanding of one's body and sexuality, and which would, I feel, give a genuine control to women over their body and their labor, and would question patriarchal control over economic resource and other societal resources in any serious fashion, will only occur if we all, working on all different issues, if we were to all sort of at least network and create. We can have our differences, but we need to, above and beyond those differences, create a common shared space. And to me, and then work. We can work for our separate interests and contradictory interests, but we need to also, on some issues, be working together and be lobby groups and pressure groups for the state, and only then that genuinely sort of feminist discourse about health and sexuality and body would develop. So it's to me it is a possibility, and not a very remote one. I mean, if we and what for that, I think what we need to do is, before sort of all of us as little units going out there, and I think there is some consciousness raising going on that various organizations have undertaken. Again, I think before we do that, we need to undertake a consciousness raising exercise within ourselves, and reach a consensus of some sort, and then go out for this consciousness raising issue. Now I'll just introduce, part of this paper's, the popular cultural discourse I'm going to present is based on a piece of fieldwork that I conducted for about 18 months in 2 villages in Punjab, and then I followed it up in the last summers. This was originally done in 92 and then 93, and then I followed it up last summers to see if there were any changes, and unfortunately none. I'm going to just introduce the villages a little bit. I picked these 2 villages, and since we're talking about sexuality issues and women are sort of talking about body and reproduction, stuff that decent women in Pakistan don't talk about. So to maintain the confidentiality of my respondents, I've just given fictitious names to these villages. I've given them the name of Risalabad and Salarpur, and I picked these 2 villages to understand how women and other people who are dealing with women's diseases and sexuality and reproductive disorders, how do they explain what is their disease theory system, and what sort of self-image for women comes out of it when women internalize that and women start believing in those discourses. Now I picked these 2 villages because Risalabad, the village that I call Risalabad, is it represents the feudal mode of production. It was a very feudal village where only 1% of the total population owned all of the agricultural land, and everybody else was their tenants and rahaks. And then there was this other village which is very close to one of the major cities in the country, and it has been sort of in some very significant manners been penetrated by the market forces. So since I wanted to see if we could make an argument that getting integrated in the market and women getting integrated into paid labor force, is that making any difference in terms of consciousness that they have about their bodies, and is that any liberating? But to my sort of there really isn't. And my argument is that there really isn't. Both in both places, the popular discourse about women's sexuality and body is equally subjugating and subordinating. Now, village Risalabad, which represented the feudal mode of production, had a set of technical relationships of production where less than 1% of the total population owned all of the agricultural land, as I've already said. Land being the major force of production, a large mass of people here were tied to and were willing to work for these few at extremely low payments and also to offer their absolute loyalty to these zimidars. The loyalty was such among the tenants that if the landlords were to order their tenants to kill for them, they would. And they would also go to gallows if they had to for their landlords. Although the basis of the tie between the landed and the landless was the control that the landowners had over the economic resources. This economic dependency was not enough to create and maintain the type of loyalty required. A tenant or a group of tenants could always go to another zimidar, to a neighboring zimidar, on the same type of economic terms. In order to build the loyalty and keep the tenants from moving from one place to another, a social and ideological ethos was required which would establish the moral and ontological superiority of the landed over the landless and would present the landed not just as rulers but guardians and protectors of the tenants. Such an ethos could legitimize the economic, political and social control, to be read as exploitation, of the latter by the former, and acceptance of the situation by the latter could be obtained. The economic power and political leadership of these zimidars in this village was very heavily dependent on the number of tenant households that they could keep tied to themselves. In order to do so, they had to establish themselves as socially and morally worthy of leadership. Subjugation of tenant women then became necessary for establishment of this authority, for they were the ones who socialized every new generation of their class. Thus, tenant women were considered to be not only the property of their own men, but also the property of the vadkas, as they called it, or the village elders. Any inappropriate act of these women became a cause of hatak or insult of the village elders as well as the parents. Not infrequently, the marriages and sexual liaisons of these women were made and broken by the word of zimidars. These marriages helped create intra-tenant cohesion, so within the village, and helped resolve intra-tenant conflicts, thus keeping the tenants from leaving the village. Sometimes the zimidars here had to get involved in tenant marriages to keep their relationships with the neighboring zimidars straight. And we can talk about that at some other point. Any inter-village or intra-village disruption of violence caused by the freedom of these tenant women could cost a zimidar social and political power and respect. Now, as opposed to village Risalabad, the Salarpur, the other village, represented a social situation deeply penetrated by the commercial and industrial forces. The technical and social relationships of production here were part of and embedded in the larger capitalist mode of production, residing in the larger urban metropolitan centers of the country. The villages here were part of a system where most of the things required for everyday existence were produced in the markets outside the village parameters. The villagers were plugged into these markets in one of the two capacities. Some of them were private producers or entrepreneurs striving to sell their products or services for more than the cost of production. The majority were those who sold their labor to the first category to make money to buy what they needed for everyday subsistence. Members of the first category generally competed with others in the same line of business as theirs in the larger market. Survival and continued capacity to create higher profits made the expansion of markets and the reduction of costs their major concern. These in turn led the system to push for two things, namely the continued expansion of productive facilities and the development and implementation of cost-cutting techniques. Now, prior to this opening up of this village to the market influences, I was told by people there that there were two types of zimidars in this village. Those who had very large amounts of agricultural lands, which were predominantly worked by the landless tenants, and the second category of zimidars who had rather small land holdings, who worked their own lands, and sometimes they also leased out lands from other people to make the two ends meet. Now, some of the things that have changed in the post-independent time for these people include government acquisition of their lands for development purposes at very cheap rates, outland migration of a lot of youth, especially from among the tenants, the division of land into very small packages due to young men marrying out of the biradri and taking control of their share of the land, since the older generation has lost the type of control that it had in the pre-independence times for them. Now, these two zimidar types in this village, in Salarpur, have reacted slightly differently to these conditions. The first category, the big landlords, followed the strategy of selling their land to interested outsiders to avoid government acquisition. Some of them converted their lands into commercial property or got it included in a governmental developmental scheme like a poultry farming project subsidized by the government in the area. Those who sold out to outside people invested the money in the nearby city and got reasonably lucrative businesses going for themselves. Now, their political role and power actually expanded to spill over into the arena of national politics. They were previously only in the villages, the powerful in the villages, but now that they have businesses going for themselves, they are now running in for elections for the parliaments, etc. They could afford to continue maintaining their traditional male-headed and controlled households with concealed and segregated women who symbolize their status in the community. These women now are responsible for producing legitimate heirs to the business estates of their husbands rather than the feudal landed estates that they used to do in the earlier generation. The second category of Zimedars were hit harder by the new situation, and they reacted to the new circumstances in a very different way. A lot of young men from this group went abroad to other cities to take up salaried jobs. They put in a lot of effort into providing their children, both sons and daughters, with modern education and professional degrees. As a result, a considerable number of women from this group, the previously small Zimedars, when I was there in the field, they were doing salaried jobs in the nearby cities and small towns. This group had several female-headed households due to male migration. Thus, younger women from this group doing salaried jobs find themselves in a context where, in contrast to their mothers, they earn money and contribute towards the daily running of the house. They're very aware of this financial role that they're playing, and they also wish for it to be recognized. They also, due to their education, expect to be recognized as individuals who have a right to control their own lives, including their sexuality. Now, during my entire fieldwork in these two villages, about 2 years almost, I did something like 63 life history interviews with women focusing on what they thought of their reproductive lives and their bodies, and how they understood the working of their bodies, and what, in their opinion, caused the women's diseases. Now, the women I talked to, they represented each socioeconomic class in both villages across 2 generations and levels of modern secular education. A scrutiny of these interviews reveals that there are several subtle and some not very subtle differences in the perceptions that women have about their bodies and their malfunctioning. These differences are rooted in the differential positionalities these women have along the axes of age, class, and educational level. These perceptual differences construct somewhat variant self-images for differentially positioned women. These perceptual differences also create slight differences in terms of the rules of activities, possibilities, and restraints. Small Zimedars. When I was there in the field, they were doing salaried jobs in the nearby cities and small towns. This group had several female-headed households due to male migration. Thus, younger women from this group doing salaried jobs find themselves in a context where, in contrast to their mothers, they earn money and contribute towards the daily running of the house. They're very aware of this financial role that they're playing, and they also wish for it to be recognized. They also, due to their education, expect to be recognized as individuals who have a right to control their own lives, including their sexuality. Now, during my entire fieldwork in these 2 villages, about 2 years almost, I did something like 63 life history interviews with women focusing on what they thought of their reproductive lives and their bodies, and how they understood the working of their bodies, and what, in their opinion, caused the women's diseases. Now, the women I talked to, they represented each socioeconomic class in both villages across 2 generations and levels of modern secular education. A scrutiny of these interviews reveals that there are several subtle and some not very subtle differences in the perceptions that women have about their bodies and their malfunctioning. These differences are rooted in the differential positionalities these women have along the axes of age, class, and educational level. These perceptual differences construct somewhat variant self-images for differentially positioned women. These perceptual differences also create slight differences in terms of the rules of activities, possibilities, and restraints that differentially located women abide by as they live out their lives. However, all these differences exist, and this is the point that I wish to sort of be noted. All these differences exist within a larger discursive context, which constructs the female experience of their own bodies as the subaltern and determines the range of possibilities for them as a social category. Now, going through all my interviews with these women, there are about 12 themes that occur across the board, across strata, among all women as they talk about the working of their bodies and the women's diseases. Now, these 12 themes are: to be a woman is to be a mother. Motherhood is not a phenomena based on an individual woman's choice or pleasure, but it's a duty. So you really don't have a choice. Motherhood is distinct from childbearing. So the one thing that women kept saying repetitively, the meaning that came out of the interviews that I had was that they understand motherhood as different from childbearing. Because you can bear a child outside an Islamically valid marriage, but that's not motherhood. That's a sin, and you really don't have a right to that child, and the child doesn't have a right to your nurturance, etc. So motherhood is distinct from childbearing. Besides producing children within a marriage, the female sexual potential is given to women by God to fulfill the sexual needs of the men they're married to on demand, and to keep the men happy. So again, they have no choice. Women are an extension of the male persona. Women's natural potential to bear children and the sexual services they render to men make them a target for male possession. This in turn makes them very vulnerable to male violence. So they kept telling me that there is a need to be protected by their own males against other males. So their sexuality is really not, or their reproductive abilities, as per these women, is really something that makes them vulnerable. And so it is then calls their men, it's a call on to their men to protect their sexuality from violence against their sexuality by other men. Women are by nature passive, sacrificing, pain-bearing and giving, whereas men are active, demanding and taking. And we decide the matter right there. 8. The eighth theme that we have sort of coming out of my discussions with them, and I'll share some of my discussions with you. Left unregulated by social rules, females can act sexually very irresponsibly, causing social as well as personal problems and diseases. The female body is a dangerous and mysterious device, the exact working of which is not fully understood by them. The female body is male property. The female body is a commodity which is very easily replaceable at the will of the male. So women's bodies are really not, women are not persons with each distinct from the other. They're just replaceable, replicable. Women are women's worst enemies and thus to be guarded against. Now, I now present very short excerpts from the life history interviews conducted to show how all of these themes are projected in the way my respondents talk about various women's diseases. I will delineate various dimensions of the self-image constructed by my respondents' belief in these disease theory systems. I'll also try to show how these ideological constructs affect the possibilities and restraints of my subjects in the everyday life. The idea that being a woman means being a mother emerges very clearly in the disease theory systems narrated by my respondents across strata. They talked about, and I quote, completion of women's body with the onset of menstruation, unquote. They say it is so because, quote, it makes a woman capable of being a mother, unquote. A very forceful statement of this idea occurred when numerous of my respondents described women who could not menstruate as, quote, a woman without menstruation is like a barren piece of land, unquote. Now, this comparison of a woman with a barren piece of land is important for us here because on one hand, it implies that a non-mother woman, like myself, is worthless, while on the other hand, it uproots such women from the domain of humans and places them in the non-human domain of nature, i.e. land. So, any woman who doesn't have an issue is really not human. She's out there in some other part of nature. The issue of motherhood not being a personal choice, but being a duty surfaces in statements like, I had several people tell me, it's a duty, being pregnant and bearing children and being mothers, it's a duty given to us by God, the duty of making the next generations. It's also a duty we have towards our husbands and families, unquote. The third theme appeared very often when my respondents were telling me the causes of late menstruation. We were talking about, one of the conditions in women's diseases were why some girls will end up having late menstruation, and very often they would attribute this phenomena to, quote, the slow development of the uterus, unquote. And when I would ask them, okay, so what causes slow development of the uterus? They would say that it is the consequence of weak blood And weak blood was understood and described as something that happened when, quote, a woman way back among her ancestors got involved in a sexually inappropriate or sinful act like sex and pregnancy out of marriage, resulting in Haraam di aulad, a child of sin. This would pollute the blood, I was told, of the mother and would be transmitted to the legitimate children of the woman, unquote. Very often they talk about how if a woman has haram that date or pregnancy, which is an outcome of sinful sexual liaison, and people get to know of it, no one would marry her and she'll never become a mother. Such women, I was told, are destined to spend all their lives bearing and killing bekhun children, illegitimate children without blood. In zina, meaning extramarital, I mean, they're accepting that they'll go on being sexually active, but if it gets known that they once had that experience, then they're destined to be producing children and killing them. The idea that women are made to gratify the sexual needs of their husbands on demand and at all costs was very blatantly expressed by my respondents at various points during our discussions. One of my respondents, while telling me about her first childbirth experience, said, "See, when I got married, I did not know anything about sex or how one got pregnant. All I knew about sex was that it was what one did when you had a husband to keep him happy. My husband was a very nice man. I was 14, he was 35. He was very kind. He taught me how and wares of sex. Very often it used to hurt, but I never said so to him. After all, he was my husband." Women very often talked about bearing painful sex because according to Sharia as they know it, and they know it primarily through the Maulvi after the Jummah prayers, a wife must never refuse her husband's sexual demands. It is a sin. I was often told when we were talking about the weak uterus, I was told that the uterus became weak-walled due to copulation during menstruation. And then they said, well, see, that is why religion prohibits that. But then the religion also says that you're not to refuse the husband and you have to provide sexual gratification to him on demand. So sometimes when men don't know the religious dicta, they ask you for sex and then you can't. I mean, if he's sinning, I don't want to sin. So I will end up going through painful sex if I have to because he's asked me for it. And then, all of these sort of themes, and I could go on and on with these discourses, but since we're working within a very restricted time, I'll just deal with a few others and then move on. Talking about this theme that emerged that women are passive and sacrificing and men are active. There's a very interesting thing that quite a few of my respondents said to me during our discussions. When she was talking about, when they were talking about their experience of childbirth. So they would often say, would you say men, and I quote, "Men are strange things. They have no patience. They're like wind." And then they would say, they would ask me, "Have you seen the Neri? The dust storm? Comes and goes, always running, going somewhere. It's not in their nature to bear pain or carry the burden for months, and months like women, or stay still." So, and then they often talked about how, Quran says that women are your tillers and that you can go to them whenever you want to and all that. Now, when going through my data for messages that construct female body as something that is very easily replaceable at the will of the men, we decipher 3 different forms that this replaceability can acquire. There are 3 different ways that these women talk about the absolute replaceability of their own selves. These forms are what I call replacement through accumulation, replacement through shedding, and replacement through use. Women talked about the first type of replacement during our discussions of a woman not being able to give birth. So, they all said that if a couple does not have a child, then it has to be because the woman is infertile. I mean, they don't even entertain the idea that there may be something wrong with the man. The man can be impotent, but they just sort of take it on to themselves, and they would tell me, okay, fine, my husband remarried and it was his right because I could not bear him children. They would justify, women would justify polygamy and their husband's right to polygyny, saying, religion permits it, and men have the type of sexual drive that one woman cannot satisfy. And if that's the case, then I would much rather have my husband remarry than have him, going around there and now keeping mistresses and stuff. So that's what I refer to as replacement through accumulation, and they're perfectly, because they've internalized this, and they're perfectly, they think it is legitimate. And then replacement through shedding is like replacement through through divorce, and then replacement through use. I mean, there were women in my field, and they were talking about how Islam. I mean, there were some women who would talk about how Islam allows sex beyond 4 wives, and there were 2 or 3 women who actually talked about a verse in Quran which I've always been very confused about, and you can have 4 wives and those that your right hand, sort of controls or whatever. Huh? I've asked several ulama, quote and unquote, but they've sort of been wishy-washy about it, and I've never gotten it. But there were women who said that Islam sort of permits that. And then I was working. One of these villages was very Shia village, and they talked about muta, and yes, you can have 4 wives, and then you can have all these temporary marriages, and they also it was very sort of acceptable for them for men to replace women that way, and they had religious and cultural legitimizations for that. Now the cultural image of an ideal female, legitimized and reinforced by these discursive themes, and the self-image that is sort of based on these themes, had several dire consequences for these women's social, political, and legal standings in the field. Some of the more important ones that I sort of observed and I saw these women go through as I was staying there was, there were severe cultural pressures and stigmatization of women who tried to go into careers other than marriages. So just because they all believe that you are made to be a mother and to serve your husband, taking up careers was censured. Women had no say in the selection of their spouses, and very often women were married away to men they actively disliked. For instance, I had a respondent. She was married to this man for 20 years, and we developed a rapport where we could sort of talk a lot about her relationship with her husband, and she was an educated woman, and one day, she was telling me all these stories, and then I said, okay, Appa, if you really don't like this man and you hate this man so much, what is your experience? Like, how do you feel when you have sex with him? And she looks at me like I was very stupid, and then she says, well, very bad. And I said, see, I can't say that very bad. I need for you to sort of put it in words a little bit. And she says, well, तुमने कभी कुत्ते को कुत्तिया से सेक्स करते देखा है? And I said, yeah. And she said, that's exactly how I felt for 20 long years. And she's produced 5 children, mind you, out of that.
Translation.
I'm sorry?
Translation.
Oh, okay. It was, okay, it is translated as, she asked me, have you ever seen a dog mount a bitch?
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, I have. And she said, well, that's how I felt for all these 20 years. And this one's produced 5 children out of that man. Cultural support to those men, there was immense amounts of cultural support to those men who kill, maim, or give away their sisters and daughters in marriage to very old men as a punishment for these girls constructing a romantic liaison with men of their choice, or marrying such men without their fathers and brothers' permission. I got to be quite friendly with this one woman there who had a relationship, who liked this one young man, and she was discovered, and her brothers married her away. She was like 18 years of age, and she was married away to somebody who was 70 and who had 2 wives already. And everybody in the community said, oh, that's great. No, but a ghairat wala aadmi tha, he's sort of exonerated himself. And that woman also in some ways accepted it. Cultural acceptance of male sexual promiscuity and victim blaming in case of rape. There was very high incidence of rape in marriage, and a total non-acknowledgement of it as a legal offence. There was total non-acknowledgement by the society of women having sexual tensions or sexual needs. There was a creation of a relational space between spouses which had no room for them to interact with each other in any other capacity but the sex objects. And there was a very high level of intra-female suspicion and conflict that keeps them fragmented and alienated from each other. There was a construction of a relationship between women and their own bodies based on fear, which in turn pushes these women to let outside forces, including men, control them, be it men of the household, religious functionaries, or medical experts. There was some sort of lines of fracture there, but my argument is, and I'm not going into the details since we're sort of out of time here, there were some people who were, there were some cases where some of these themes were not coming up. And there were some cases where, a woman would endorse one of the themes and then negate it. But my argument is that these were women who were younger, who had some sort of Western education, who were living on the limits of the feudal and the capitalist mode of production, and so they were dealing with that material reality, and as a consequence of that, those lines of fracture arose. But they were really not. The fact that these lines of fracture arose were not really empowering these women. Now, so this is one form of discourse. When I look at the health policy formulated by women, and we can talk about some of the features of the health policy of the government of Pakistan, I'll not go into that. I'll just say my problems with that health policy, and we can talk about the health policy. My problems with the health policy is that the way women's, the health policy says, when they talk about women's health, they say the problem areas are maternal mortality, infant mortality, and lack of bad nutrition during lactation and pregnancy. Now and then the whole health policy is engineered towards dealing with these areas. My problems there are that women's health here is visualized as maternal health. Thus, women very conveniently become mothers, and they are treated as such by health planners. Once converted into mothers, the entire national health policy projects and research defines and deals with women as human resource, workers, contributors to the economy and national development, and producers and custodians of future workers. Now, thus, woman as a person and socially located, constructed, and restrained being is lost. And it is redefined as a body that produces and reproduces for the national development. Health is, again, health policy, when we are talking women in health, is defined in very functional terms as the state of optimum capacity of an individual for the effective performance of her socially designated and required roles. Now, when that happens, this leads to visualizing the female body as self-propelling machine for the most part, and thereby mystifying and concealing the real causes of diseases which lie in the social context of the female patients. Illness here becomes a natural and individualized phenomena. It reduces women to objects of medical gaze. As a consequence of this, objectification of women occurs. Women's own experience of their bodies as subjects never emerges, and treatment becomes an individually administered process based on biochemosurgical intrusions. Whenever social and cultural causes and contexts of illness are considered, the consideration is in terms of individual patients' lifestyles. The approach of all of the health planning in our country is based on the assumption that modern medical knowledge and practice is objective and scientific. It's about objective and scientific truths. That means we never ever talk about the fact that modern medicine, as it is practiced in our country, is very male controlled, and the international, the experimentation that takes place on female bodies to serve the interests of the pharmaceutical international capital never ever comes into picture, because we are assuming, the assumption there is that modern medical knowledge is objective. It's about truths of the body. And so you're not even looking at it as political construction. You're not even looking at the politics of medicine and medical knowledge. So problems with that. Also, the view of medical pluralism that our health policy takes. It ignores the social, constructional, and the ideological and social control elements of traditional healthcare systems. There is a tendency sometimes to deal with the Dais and the other traditional and the Hakims and the homeopaths as people who have, more rapport with people, and sometimes we talk about them as more, providing healthcare which makes sense to these people. So there's this humaneness to the traditional healthcare systems, and we tend to forget that the traditional healthcare system is also very patriarchally controlled, and the knowledge is very patriarchally constructed. And of course, when we talk about women's health issues, we do not talk about all the violence against women. Violence is not even a health issue that ever comes up in policy statements. So I think what we need to do here, if we want to get the popular cultural discourses a little more gender friendly, and if we want to make the health policy a little more gender friendly and gender sensitive, what we need to do is we need to question the very patriarchal values. And then if we want to question that, what we will have to question is Islamic texts. I mean, a lot of how women think about their bodies is really coming from popular and scholarly Islamic texts. So we as feminists, I think, if we want women to connect to their bodies and to control their sexuality in any substantial way, then we need to start a movement where we ask for questioning, historicizing, deconstructing all the religious texts, and including not just, we're talking deconstructing tafsir. Why is it that it's always men who've written tafsirs? We're also talking deconstructing Quran, putting it in its historic perspective, because there's a lot of what women believe about their sexuality and body that's coming to them from Quran, some of it is coming to them from tafsir, and of course we need to deconstruct the popular Islamic discourse which is coming from the Maulvi. And another very important source of how women were constructing their sexuality, which was alienating them and subjugating them, was what they were taught in schools. So the way genders are represented in school textbooks needs to be questioned, and we as feminists, I think, need to take that onus on, because nobody else is going to do it. We also need to see to it that we have a greater representation of women within the state, and not just women, but feminist women. Yeah. So, I mean, there's this whole thing about, if we have somebody coming from a very feudal, comfortable background out there, that's not really going to make a difference. We have women in Jamaat-e-Islami. Putting them out there in Majlis-e-Shura never made a difference. So we need to see to it that radical feminist women are put into policy, they're integrated into policy making process. Unless we do that, we are, I'm afraid, going to not be able to create a truly feminist discourse with reference to which women can get to know their bodies, and then we'll be stuck in the situation where Gayatri Spivak, the situation that she talks about, that the dominant discourse, the patriarchal dominant discourse, is so encompassing that even when we are moving positions, and even when we are trying to speak, the subaltern cannot speak. And on that I'll end.